Now finally back to the client. So this is the read-only version as we left it. Remember, we did finally add the ability to filter so I can pick a doctor and just see the patients for that doctor, right? But if I click on one, nothing really happens at this point in time. I can go back to them all. And of course, I can resize it, right? And things like that. And it's installed as an app on the system now, et cetera, right? Notice that things aren't sorted yet, neither in the drop-down list or on the screen. That's another little issue we'll deal with later on, but the main thing is it's read-only at this point in time. Let me point out, I did take a moment and add inside Jeeves, remember my butler? I find him helps me out here. So I'm using him right now. It's maybe not best practice, but I'm using him at work to keep track of the path to my web API. Because I just published it to Azure, I can use the URI for it in Azure. Notice it's HTTPS as well. Gets around the issue on the local system using secure connection, right? So I publish it up here, MedicalOfficeWebAPI 2025, right? By the way, when you do your homework, I've asked you to use your actual student identifier in the path for your web APIs, whatever goes in front of the @ of your email address. Anyway. So yeah, that's where I'm getting my data from, is the actual live version of the web API we just finished building up in Azure. Okay, so we want to make this fully functional now as an application. Well, let me close everything. Close everything. All right, so we have a copy-paste file to help us out. Okay. All right, so in utilities, okay, remember we talked about all those nice status codes and we could bundle up information in them, right? So all we get on the client side are responses to our requests through HTTP. It's up to us what we do with that response. So I'm going to follow the approach of creating an actual exception because I know how to work with them and handle them inside my code. So I'm going to define what I'm going to call an API exception. So I'm going to go into utilities. It makes sense I put it here. I'm going to add a class called API exception. Let's get that added here. And it's not much to it. It's a pretty simple class. Okay, public class. And it inherits from a general exception, right? Now I have to add some usings here and be a little bit careful because as I do so, there's two choices, system.net.http and the much older Windows web HTTP. Do not select that, okay? Make sure you use system.net, the newer implementation here, right? And even the status code, same thing, system.net, right? Okay, that gets rid of all the underlining. I've added the necessary usings, the ones I actually want. So you see, it's pretty simple, right? Basically, it gets our response message, the status code, and an errors collection. So it's designed to hold. So I'm going to parse that information out of the response I get back. I'm going to store the status code and a simple collection of strings for each error message, right? So that's how I will bundle up the feedback I'm going to give to the client. Okay, now who's going to do the work for me? Well, of course, I'm going to ask Jeeves to do it as well, right? So I'm going to add a method to my butler to actually take a response and build me an API exception. Okay, again, system.net.http. Okay. So basically, I see Jeeves, here's a response from the server, okay? Do something with it. So it'll take the response, okay, and it'll just parse it out, create a dictionary, okay, to hold all the error messages, deserialize, okay, this object, and then create my API exception, right? Add the messages as I need them, whether it's coming from the hierarchical model state or from the individual messages that I added one at a time. Puts it all together into a single object that then I can use to present the information to the user. Okay. Now, as I mentioned in my copy paste, the client noticed in our first version of our simple read-only web client there that nothing was sorted yet. So that's really, really easy. We're just going to go into the repositories here, the doctor repository, where we get our patient list. And set the, oh, hang on. Sorry, I had repository on the brain. It's actually in show patients here in the code behind the main page, right? To get the data just in alphabetical order, okay? Then right down here where we assign it to the item source, okay, of our list. That's where I just will add a little bit of a link expression. We're going to add an order by. Now, our patient doesn't have a formal name put together, so I'll do an order by last name, then by first name. That way the data showing on the page will be at least in an alphabetical order. But we want to do the same kind of thing up here in fill dropdown, where we set the item source of our combo box, right? But it's a little different because the doctor actually has a formal name summary property. And because they're already formed, fully formed objects from the data that was downloaded, I can use the summary property here in my order by clause, right? So that solves that little problem that the client was unhappy things weren't sorted. I could run it to show you that they're now sorted, but I'm sure you trust me. All right. So we have to come back to our repositories now, okay, and actually add additional functionality for insert, update, delete. So I can start with doctor. So iDoctor repository only defined our two methods, get doctors and get one doctor, right? Well, we want to add then 3 new tasks for add doctor, update doctor, and delete doctor, right? So coming now to the actual repository, it's going to yell at me because I'm not implementing everything it's supposed to, but we'll quickly do that, right? I'll leave all that alone. Actually, no, I'm going to leave it open because we have to make some changes there as well, right? Let me just grab 3 that I need here to add. Okay, so add doctor. Basically, we get our doctor to add. So we come to the client, we post, right? So we'll send this to the post action, API/doctor, doctor to add. If we get a success status code, okay, if we don't, I should say, get a success status code, we're going to ask Jeeves to create an API exception for me, build it on the response. So all the information I get about why I couldn't add this doctor, maybe there was validation errors or whatever, I'll get all that, and then I'll get it stored into my new API exception, and then I'll throw that to the actual client, right? Same idea for the doctor to update. I just have the URI for my put, and if I don't get a success status code, then I'll create an API exception again. Exactly the same for the delete. So why did I leave the others open? Well, basically, I want to do the exact same thing in here, right? I didn't have, when I first made these, I didn't have my API exception yet, so I just threw a generic exception with my own message in it, but no details coming from the server. My only best guess on what's going wrong. So I'm just going to replace that in the 2 gets. So if there's a problem getting the data, might as well use the same API exception approach. Good. Okay. That's the doctor repository. Now let's come to the patient repository. Oh, first the interface. We have to add our 3 new tasks for add, update, and delete a patient. Okay, I'll just save all that. And then into the patient repository, again, we'll just ask Jeeves to give us a finely tuned exception as opposed to this generic general sort of one that I'm doing here. Okay, I'm leaving this one because it's kind of specific enough. I could just leave the, yeah, you know what, it doesn't matter. That's okay. I'll leave it that way. All right. Now the other three actions, these are really simple, these actions. It's just the same thing over and over again. The only difference is the URI, whether it's a put, a delete, or a post, right? So we just basically ask it to do its work and return the exception if the response isn't a success status code. So that makes our life pretty easy. All right, but we've added now full CRUD capabilities to both of our actual repositories. Now we need to come back to the code behind page for the main page itself. Okay. So actually I'm going to start on the XAML of the main page to begin with, right? As it was right now, okay, we had our grid view come up, okay, bound to patient, right? And we showed the summary properties that we wanted to from the patient class in each item on the grid view. But I showed you a minute ago, I could click on it to my heart's content and nothing happens, right? The reason nothing happens is there's no event handler for that. We have to add 2 additional attributes to the opening tag here of the grid view itself. Okay. I'm going to add is item click enabled, set that to true. Now I've enabled the click event basically. But the item click event then will be handled in code, in the code behind, by my patient grid view item click. Now I'm going to create that in a moment, right? So that's good. Okay, one more thing. My idea is, this is the simplest way I could think of building an interface like this, is we have our patients, right? If I want to edit a patient, delete a patient, or just see the details, all 3 can be accomplished on a details page basically by clicking the patient, right? So that's what I'm going to do. I can just click the patient and then go to see the details on a separate page. Now the only thing I can't do that way is add, right? So I'm going to come down here. I used a relative panel at the bottom, so in my bottom left corner was a refresh button. So I'm just going to add a button here for add patient, right? Button add, okay. It'll be relative panel aligned horizontal center, so it'll be in the center of the bottom, and away we go. Click is button add click, and we'll just put that code in the code behind. So those are the only changes I actually have to make to the UI itself, but in the code behind then I have a few changes to make, right? Okay, we're going to add one line of code in particular in the try block of our fill dropdown. Button add is enabled true, right? So we'll enable the add button as we fill data in the drop-down list, okay? That's because we're going to disable it at other times, so that's a good spot to re-enable it. We're going to add a catch block for our API exception as well. So it has to come before our generic exception, right? They have to, because this inherits from exception, it has to come first. So if there's an actual API exception when I go and I get my doctors to fill my list, then I'll come down here and this bit of code will ask Jeeves, right? Of course, Jeeves has built the API exception that was thrown here. So it gives me a chance to just show it in a message here, problem filling the doctor selection, and the details of the message will show up. Okay. Now in show patients then, that was the one that we called to actually fill the actual bulk of the form with each patient, right? We're going to add a catch block again for our API exception. All right. And that's it. So now we'll get all the feedback we want, but we do need 2 other event handlers, right? One for when we click on a patient, that's our item click event for the grid view, and one for when we click our add button. So I'll just add those event handlers. Right? So item click, really, all we do is we do a frame.navigate. We'll go to a detail page, which I haven't made yet, so that's why it's underlined in red, okay? But as we navigate there, we can pass something, right? So the clicked item is an actual patient, right? But I need to, it's just an object, right? So I'm going to cast it as a patient, so when I go to the details page, I'm actually passing the patient. So that works fine when I just click on a patient that's already in my grid view. Now when I click my add button, I don't have a patient yet, so I'll just new one up. I'll make up a new patient, right? Now if I end up not saving it in the end, no big deal, okay? But you know, I do find it best to set the date of birth to like the current date, just so that, you know, when it appears, I don't have to go to the calendar and go from the year 1799 or 2000 or year 0, right? And there we go. And same thing, I'll just navigate to my new details page, passing the new patient instead. And that's basically it, okay? Now we need our new page. All right, so I'll just come up here, right click, we'll add a new item. Just be a little bit careful here. I want to show all templates. I always make sure I come down and select XAML, because there's more than one choice sometimes, right? And it's a blank page, a XAML page is what I want, right? If I left it on everything, I think there's more than one option for blank page. So make sure you go XAML first and then blank page. And I'm going to name it patient detail page. That's because that's the name I decided to use. Okay. At least now that it's there, when I come back here, this should go away in a moment or two, right? Because there you go, because it will see that there is such a thing. Now, I've mentioned it before. I find the design surface virtually useless, so I just shift left and right and shrink it over and get rid of it off the screen so I can see my code. All right, now, one thing we have to worry about with UWP, which, by the way, you don't with Maui, you know, when you have apples and oranges, they don't play nice together. So even something like a byte, okay, which are values from 1 to 256 type of thing, right, which we use for our expected yearly visits, right? We made it as small as possible. Well, okay, to convert that to a text, to show in a text box, doesn't work automatically, right? Date times have a challenge because most of the controls use a date time offset, and we're storing a date time in the database. So we end up having to supply converters. You could do it all in code as you copied the stuff. That was the old-fashioned approach from years ago, right? You have your data, and you copy it into the controls, and later on you copy it out, and so on, right? But then we got into binding. Binding is so much nicer to use than you just define your user interface. But to do automatic binding, in cases like this, you have to provide a converter. So anticipating I'm going to need some, I'm going to add a new folder altogether. I'm going to call it converters. I have another new folder, do I? No, okay, good. And inside here I'm going to end up needing 2 classes. The first one I'm going to call datetime to offset converter. Really it's datetime to datetime offset, but I shortened it because I'm lazy, right? So there it is. So it's in my converters namespace. And, you know, I found, although in many applications you can get by with internal, don't do it in a UWP because internal works fine if everything's in the same assembly, right? But the page ends up in a different assembly from the other code in the system, right? So always make it public. And I'm going to inherit from value converter. Okay, so I'll say, yes, please implement that. And what it gives me is a convert and convert back, right? Pretty straightforward. Okay, so as I convert the object value, etc., all I really need to do is I'm going to first check if I get past null, then I just return null. That works fine. Null becomes null, right? Otherwise, okay, I will take the value, cast it as a date time, store it here, and then what I'll return is I'll create a datetime offset passing the date, right? And that does the conversion for me in code, so then I can use this directly in my binding expression and have it go from convert it forward. Now to convert back, basically just the reverse process to some degree. And for my catch blocks, I'm just kind of going with something that's, I want something there, so I'm just going to go with a minimum value, right? Same thing on the way back. But on the way back, basically, if it's null, I give null. Otherwise, I take the value, make it a datetime offset, and then all I do is go dot datetime with a datetime offset to do the conversion back. Okay, I need one more. Add class, byte to string converter. And I'll just put the code in place here. Okay. All right, so basically we want strings, right? So string empty, if it's null, makes sense. Otherwise, we take the value and we just do a string format, okay? No, it's 0 decimal places because, hey, it's a byte, right? There's no decimal places in a byte. Going back the other way is a little more interesting, right? Because we want to handle the case, somebody might have typed some garbage in there, might have accidentally hit a letter or something as they were typing. So this is one way to kind of get a clean value. We're going to strip out basically anything, any character that is not a digit, right? And then I can just convert that string, system convert to byte, okay, my string, which has got anything removed that is not a digit itself. And that should do the job for me. It seems to work so far okay. I stole that from somebody else's tutorial, I confess, okay? It was before AI was popular, so I didn't take it from AI. I stole it from another person. All right, there you go. So there's my 2 converters. So I have them. Oh, yeah, save, save. You know what? I just reminded myself. I want to double check something. I got in trouble. Ah, look at that, internal. Ah. See, it worked. I'm surprised it even worked with the main page. But I know going forward, it's a danger, so. There we go. Just make sure those are public, so no matter how many assemblies I get going here, it'll always work. Okay, now, let's get back to our patient detail page. All right. I will need a namespace for my converters. It'll be an XML namespace. Yeah, I did that right. Might as well call it converters. And then it will equal using. And there we go. My converters folder. Okay. All right. Now I can add the converters as page resources. Remember, a page only has one content object, my grid, but I can add page resources, so that's good. So I have my 2 converters. The underlining is just because it hasn't had time to quite figure them out yet, but it will. That will go away in time. Okay. All right, so now they're there. I can use them. So like I did when I first built this, I'm going to replace the grid, or at least wrap it in a scroll viewer. That way, if you turn it sideways, you don't have room to see everything, you can flick the screen up and down, right? Now, I will definitely make a mess if I don't copy all my code, so I'm just going to grab it and put it in place. Believe me, you do not want to watch me try to type all this myself. Okay. So it looks like a lot, but it's really not that much, okay? And overall, I'll have a grid, my layout root here. Again, I'm using that same little image for a background, nice opaque in the background, that's fine. Okay, I just have an auto and a star size row, right? The auto is basically like the head, and inside that is this stack panel, goes in row 0, just with the title up at the top there. And then as well, okay, oh, one thing that's different. I should point this out before I go on. Back on main page, remember, I decided that the data type of my data template in the grid view was defined as a patient. And then I could bind, okay, all these properties to the different properties of my patient, right? This page is going to be a little different. The detail page itself will be bound to the one patient I'm focused on. It's going to be what we call the data context of the whole page, right? I'm going to give it a name. I'm just going to call it view. It's kind of a homage to the view model approach without doing proper model view model at this point, right? So that's why you'll see in code view. View is talking about the actual patient that is the data context of the page. So I can say medical office, and then in fairly good sized text, I'll have the name of the page right up there in the header at the top, okay? All right. Then we come down, and then in the next row, the star size row of our layout root is my content panel, again another grid, okay? It has 2 columns and a whole bunch of rows, right? The column on the left is like, you know, it's our usual input form, right? Caption, input. So the left column, size auto, is for all the captions for each piece of information, each property of the patient, and the star size is for the input controls for them. So this is all, this one is auto because it's a combo box and it doesn't work very well if I don't give it auto. And then auto is also at the bottom for the footer, okay, where I'll have some buttons to choose from, and then a star size in between. So basically these are paired text block, text box, text block, text box, just bound, as I said, to different properties of the view, okay? So here's my binding expression, two-way, right? So changes I make get written back to the object, changes in the object would be presented in the view, etc. They get more interesting as we get down further, first name, middle name, last name. And okay, OHIP, that's straightforward. All right, so, here's my doctor, right? So it's a combo box, okay? Now, data value path, or sorry, display member path, we use that even on our previous main page. That's the formal name, last name, comma, first name of the doctor, okay? The value is the ID, right, of the patient, but the selected value, the ID of the doctor. That's the ID of the doctor, right? The selected value will be the foreign key of the patient. So we're binding, instead of bind, we're binding to the foreign key, doctor ID of our patient, the data context that we're working with, two-way. Then this one, this is the first one we're using our converter, right? So this is our expected yearly visits. So text bind to the view's expected yearly visits. Converter, it's a static resource by this name. Mode two-way, right? So that handles the conversion going between the string as shown in the text box and the value as stored as a byte in the model itself. Then we have our calendar date picker. Again, the binding expression over here, right? It's the date of birth, and our converter is our date time to datetime offset converter, two-way binding, so changes are written back to the object. Then finally, in the footer here, I use a relative panel just to make it easy to arrange the buttons. Notice it's kind of interesting here. The middle one, the save button, is aligned horizontally with the center, okay? Whereas the delete just is left of the save button, and the cancel is just the right of the save button. So, you know, they just say bundled up. I use a bit of a margin to provide some space between the buttons themselves. All right, so that's a walkthrough of the XAML. Sorry, we're almost going to run out of time here, but I'll try to get this just finished. Okay, so our code behind for the details page. Okay. Is it okay if I just put it in place? Thank you. Rather than trying to, it'll be quicker than me doing it a bit at a time and messing it up. Okay. So right at the top inside the page, here I'm declaring this object which I called view. You saw that in the code of the XAML. It's a patient object, right? I need my two repositories. Okay, my interface is here for my doctor and patient repository. And I'm going to have a page level variable here, a Boolean for insert mode, right? Remember, we're using this for both update and insert. So that way I'll just keep track. Am I actually adding a new patient or just updating a patient, right? So in the constructor, of course, I get my repositories ready, and I call fill dropdown similar to what I did on the other one. The main difference is the dropdown I'm filling now is an actual foreign key. It's not a filter, right? Okay, but this is interesting. We navigated to here. right? So I have a on navigated to that I can override, okay? And here is where I can figure out what darn mode I'm in, because I can grab the parameter. Remember, we passed the patient object as the parameter when we navigated here. So I'll take the parameter, which is an object, cast it as my patient, and that's how I assign it to the view itself, right? Then I can check the ID. It'll be 0 if I just newed up a new one to make a new record. Otherwise, it'll actually have a value from the database. So the else is I'm in insert mode, okay? If it's equal to 0, then I'm in, sorry, insert mode is, oh, sorry, is false. Sorry. So if I'm inserting, then I'll delete the delete button, I'll disable. There's no point being able to click the delete button when I'm just adding a new record. It doesn't even exist yet in the database. That'd just be silly, right? And I set my insert mode true or false depending on whether I'm inserting a new record or editing an existing record, right? Okay. All right. Now, after fill dropdown, okay, then I call fill dropdown, and then I get my doctors, doing an order by, this time to make sure it is in alphabetical order. Don't want to get complaints from the client again. And we set the data context to the view. Now you might say, well, why am I waiting to here? I could have done it earlier on, right? When I first defined this patient that I called view. Well, I wanted to wait till I actually had the data bound, right, from the doctor combo. Otherwise, it doesn't have time to actually make sure it's selected to the right value when I bind the data context to the actual patient. So I needed to wait till this was here. I've learned that the hard way. So I'm sharing it with you now, okay? API exception, if there's one of those, a general exception, right? Just giving the feed data. Now, if I don't have an API exception, this is most likely this one. I get a connection with server, okay? I've lost my connection to the web API, whether it's down or my internet is down or whatever, right? Okay. All right, then I have my common save button. I can use save for both insert and update, okay? So that's why I check. If the doctor ID is 0, oh, actually no, that check comes later. If the doctor ID is 0, again, that darn combo box can be tricky sometimes. So I want to make sure I actually have a doctor selected, right? And that I do have a doctor assigned as the foreign key value. Otherwise, I'm right away going to show them a message, you must select the primary care physician. Should never be a problem really, but sometimes in the timing of things in these UWP apps, I've had it be an issue, so I put that in place. Else, as long as that very rare issue comes up, then I just check my mode. If I'm in insert mode, I call add patient, otherwise I call update. And the repository will look after doing everything else its job is supposed to do. And then, if all goes well, I just go back to the main page. I just use frame go back. If there's an aggregate exception, an aggregate happens when there's a combination of exceptions together. So this will give me a chance to say one or more exceptions occurred. Very rarely happens, but you kind of have to account for it. My API exception is one that comes from feedback in the response I get from the web API. And my general one is usually I lost my connection. So that handles both saving on an insert and update. Finally, I get to my delete, right? And I'm going to confirm. Good practice, right? Always make sure, are you really sure you want to do this? Okay. So fortunately, Jeeves has a confirm dialog that I added there using the content dialog. So I'll basically ask, are you sure you want to do this? Okay. And if the button is the secondary one, which is yes, okay, then I'll call delete patient and pass the view, and away we go. If all goes well, I'll just go back. Otherwise, I'll check for all my errors, and that's it. Now, if I click cancel, easiest one of all, just go back to the main page. Doesn't matter what I've done on the details page, I just go back to the main page. Hopefully, it'll run. Now, of course, remember, I'm not even running another Visual Studio. It's connecting right to the Azure, the web API up there in Azure. Oh, end of file. Yeah, darn. An extra curly brace. I know. It always throws me when I look down there and I see Tizen errors. I mean, why does it show me that? I don't care. Oh, okay. All right, so here we are. I can filter, okay, and then I can just go in, I can edit a patient. Now, of course, it looks pretty weird that way, but in this mode, you know, on a mobile device. Let me do something. I'm going to copy this OHIP number here. I'm just going to cancel, go back. Let's edit somebody else. I'm going to give them that OHIP number. And we'll click Save. There we go. So this one actually went right to the controller, found the duplicate OHIP number, okay, sent the response back. Jeeves interpreted it as an API exception. I'm showing it here. Bada bing, bada boom. Way to go. All right, good work. What else could I do here? Let's just make this 22 or 29. Oh gosh, why did I have to pick a birth date so far back? Now, it'll catch this one first, actually, won't it? Oh, the number, yeah, okay, sorry. It was able to do that locally, the number of yearly visits between 1 and 12, because that's in the annotation. The date won't get checked until it gets to the iValidatable object, which happens after all the data annotations are taken care of. I want to show seeing a few errors at once, okay? The last name cannot be left blank, expected number between, right? So that's one of the nice things about that approach with Jeeves building my error message. It just lists all the problems at once instead of one at a time, except for things that can't be determined, right? Annotations go first, then the date. So if I fix all those, then the date would show up, and then finally the concurrency would show up. But eventually, all the error messages will show up. All right, so any questions about that? Okay, I can add patient, of course, just gives me a blank form, and away we go. All right, I don't like that. When I have a lot of data, I should make sure that I limit the size so I can always see this footer, eh? Yeah, yeah, because it's easy when there's only 5 or 6 because I put so much sample data in. That's a quick change. I'll fix that later.